Testing. Okay. Time for dis and dat information. Aside from the hiatus, looking at Marx's theory of equilibrium, or as it were, general equilibrium, and analytic Marxism. The issue that when we last looked at it was a issue about definition 2, that is strong analytic Marxism or rational choice Marxism, RCM. RCM is defined by C2 and C3 plus C1 prime, a commitment to the use of the state-of-the-arts methods of analytical philosophy and positivist social science, which may be the to have an anti-positivist critique, I think is a important corollary. Let's put it that way. And C4 prime, lowercase 1, a commitment to methodological individualism as the doctrine that all social phenomena, their structure and their change, are in principle explicable in ways that only involve subjects, their properties, their goals, their beliefs, and their actions. Now, that issue is, not restricted, I would assert, to methodological individualism, and considering that, 30 plus years have happened since a commitment to methodological individualism, we can rethink C4 prime. The individualism problem, of course, has a positivist frame on it that does not necessarily have to be the case, but then that would require us to create, C5 or C5 prime, because I think that from a methodological point of view, we've moved a little bit further beyond then. And then I think if you, as our author here has moved a little further beyond as well, the idea of or the problematic, let's put it that way, of so-called postmodern Marxism addresses some of those issues. And I think that you can see that in, let's say, the difference between, for example, the current synthesized version of Marxian approaches that do include certain neoclassical methodological elements. I would assert that that's kind of the current, sort of the way it's, from a pedagogical point of view, that's the way it's taught. But that doesn't deny the contributions of Morishima, et cetera. But it does require us to sort of go back and look at the Japanese discourse in the 1950s, as well as Luxemburg and a bunch of other folks. So methodological individualism is certainly one position, but it is not the only position from an idea about subjects. And if you want to go a little further, and that's not where I'm going at the present moment, but the idea of, what is revolutionary subjectivity in the context? Because is revolutionary subjectivity a commitment to irrational actor models, whereas in this particular description of analytical Marxism, C4 prime subsection 2, a commitment to rational actor models. We know that we've moved past that to more evolutionary versions of what counts as agency models and et cetera. And so we're in a different place now. So I would assert to you that from a historical point of view, that C4 prime and 1 and 2 are important elements, but I think that we need to sort of, if we were going to rewrite this article or revise this article, it would be to talk a little bit more about what counts as a reasonable, without going to a full, kind of counterfactual, that C5 there's a C5 and a C5 prime that we might have to think about. So Veneziani gives us a interesting introduction to for what for many of us was the important kind of problem to look at in the 90s, and that it moved beyond that, certainly. And of course, once you made the decision to defend it and from a positivist point of view, and to assert that there was something more Marxist, or that there was a Marxist way to talk about rational choice, then, in some ways you were, it's not a fool's errand necessarily, but I think it has certain, I would assert, perhaps certain teleological problems. So anyway, without going into that, let's continue on with this article, noting that it is a moderately old article, but that it gives us the kind of literature review that I think is really necessary, considering that others have now, with all due respect, rediscovered Jerry Cohen's work in Analytical Marxism, which is not the only version of it, certainly. And in fact, is another one of those sort of straw arguments, but that's a whole other story. So we're at section 4, Romer on exploitation and class. A debate on Analytic Marxism is not expounded on Cohen's 1978 analysis of forces and relations of production in Marx's theory of history, or Przeworski's analysis of class conflict and the political process. That is Burawoy, Przeworski, Wood, Burawoy, Elster, etc. Analysis of class alliances, revolutionary motivations, and social change. Romer's theory of exploitation and classes, however, has definitely had the greatest or the biggest impact in the social sciences. This is explained partly by the central relevance of the concepts of exploitation and class in Marx's theoretical construction, and by the provocative and original results obtained by Romer on both, and partly by the fact that Romer's theory is the most rigorous and consistent application of the analytic Marxism methodology. Let me break here for a second and say, yes. And then there's empiricism, the issues that would come up against that. And I assume there wasn't a big enough army of graduate students to work through this. But anyway, consider a general theory of exploitation and class, Romer 82. Romer assumes that there are n agents with identical preferences and equal access to the production technology of lowercase n goods. Production requires capital that is, in principle, equally distributed. Marxian exploitation is defined as unequal exchange of labor. Agent I is exploited, or an exploiter, if she works more or less time than is embodied in her consumption bundle. First, a pre-capitalist subsistence economy is analyzed in which agents minimize labor, subject to a minimum consumption requirement, and there is no labor market. Only physical goods, inputs and outputs, are traded. In equilibrium, aggregate labor is equal to the labor time embodied in the aggregate subsistence requirement, but the labor time is not equally distributed if there is DOPA, that is, asset-rich agents are exploiters, while asset-poor agents are exploited. Hence, Romer concludes that exploitation can exist without exchange of living labor, and thus without domination at the point of production. Next, a labor market is introduced in the subsistence economy. This allows Romer to define classes in Marxian terms based on the, quote, the way in which an agent relates to the means of production, that is, hiring labor power, selling labor power, working his own shop, close quote. In this economy, classes emerge as the product of individual optimization. In equilibrium, asset-rich agents are capitalists, that is, net hirers of labor power. Asset-poor agents are proletarians, net sellers of labor power. And there is a class of self-employed petty bourgeois. Finally, asset-rich agents are exploiters, asset-poor agents are exploited, and the class exploitation correspondence principle, the CECP, capitalists, this is theorem 2.7 in Romer, capitalists are exploiters, proletarians are exploited, and the petty bourgeois have an ambiguous exploitation status, Romer also proves the functional equivalence of credit and labor markets. The subsistence economy with a labor market is isomorphic to an identical economy with a capital market. Asset-rich agents are net lenders and exploiters. Asset-poor agents are net borrowers and exploited. Romer concludes that there is nothing in the institution of the labor market intrinsically necessary for bringing about the Marxian phenomena of exploitation and class, competitive markets, and private differential ownership of the means of production are the institutional culprits in producing exploitation and class. It's Romer, page 93. According to Romer, these results, which can be extended to accumulation economies with revenue maximizing agents, prove the positive and normative priority of DOPA and suggests that Marx's theory of exploitation be interpreted as a kind of resource egalitarianism. Yet, the Marxian definition of exploitation as unequal exchange of labor faces analytic and conceptual problems. In an economy with a more general convex technology, labor values cannot be defined prior to prices. Moreover, if agents' labor endowments and or preferences over leisure are heterogeneous, it is possible for some very wealthy producers to be exploited and for some very poor producers to be exploiters. Hence, Romer concludes that Marx's definition of exploitation as unequal labor exchange should be abandoned as a problematic proxy for the normatively relative phenomena, namely DOPA, and the resulting welfare inequalities. He provides an alternative game theoretic definition of exploitation based on DOPA, which aims to generalize Marxian exploitation and to capture its essential normative content, which is interpreted as requiring an egalitarian distribution of resources in the external world. Now, Romer's property relations definition of exploitation can be summarized as follows, footnote 20. In an economy, capital N, characterized by private property for any coalition S, capital S, of its members, and its complement coalition S prime in N, capital S is capitalistically exploited by S prime if, number one, S would improve by withdrawing the economy with its per capita share of alienable property. Number two, S prime would be worse off, footnote 21. Now, both Romer's definitions and his models have been criticized, mainly based on issues of interpretation of Marx's theory. So Leibowitz of 1988 argues that Romer incorrectly gives logical priority to property relations over capitalist relations of production, whereas in Marx's theory, the former, that is, property relations, are determined by the latter. Thus, Romer does not realize that, according to Marx, quote, the situation in which the purchase of labor power did not occur was explicitly pre-capitalist. You can see already what the problem is. For instance, in the subsistence economy with the capital market, what Romer calls exploitation should be defined as usury, which is interesting. In addition, Leibowitz argues that by assuming perfect information, perfectly enforceable contracts, especially in the purchase of labor power, and no restrictions to the use of any technology, Romer effectively assumes away all possible effects of the relations of production on the production function, and thus on profits and exploitation. Now, it's the assuming away that, you can see where the problem could arise. Anderson and Thompson of 1988 also stressed Romer's neglect of the labor/labor power distinction, which is equivalent to assuming that workers do not resist being exploited, And note that profits in his models are just a scarcity rent. How controversial is that? Interestingly enough, we'll get back to that. Moreover, by overlooking the actual features of the labor process, Romer's models cannot properly capture the concept of class, lacking any direct social relation among workers or between them and the capitalists. It is unclear how a sense of class comradeship might arise. Foley, 1989, criticizes Romer's concept of class as nothing more than a static typology of equilibrium labor allocation and an associated inequality and control over social resources and consumption of social product. He rejects Romer's definition of exploitation as private and ahistorical, a feature that has been emphasized to various degrees and extent by many critics, Burway and Wood, for example. Instead, according to Foley, the most important historical aspect of class societies is that exploiting classes, through their control over social surplus production, shape the reproduction of the society, and in particular, the directions in which change can take place. Based on this interpretation of Marx's theory, Foley finds Romer's emphasis on the normative aspects of exploitation as an abstract measure of injustice misplaced. Now, I would assert that, you could probably solve some of this, or Romer's current work addresses that kind of issue. Well, maybe not. Anyway, moreover, the exclusive stress on DOPA inverts the roles of exploitation and inequalities in Marx's theory, wherein exploitation is, in the first instance, an injury to the life of direct producers because it removes from them the control over a part of the fruits of their energies, talents, and efforts. And it is for this reason that it gives rise to inequalities. Now, Dembski and Elliott and Wood note that Romer defines exploitation as unjust advantage, a form of inequality that is secondary rather than primary exploitation, according to Marx, and thus his conclusion that only DOP matters is not surprising. Now, these critiques raise important questions. They do not seem decisive. To be sure, exegetical and definitional issues are crucial in the evaluation of Romer's approach, especially as an interpretation of Marx's theory. Most critics provide considerable textual evidence against Romer's reading of Marx, which would suggest that his models, albeit interesting, are not suitable to evaluate Marx's theory. Yet, as shown by various endless debates, few issues in Marxist thought can be satisfactorily settled uniquely at the level of definition and interpretation, of course. Besides, fidelity to Marx's writings is not a major constraint for Romer, who substantially revises Marx's concepts and definitions. So, a critique entirely based on textual evidence arguably misses the point. For instance, Anderson and Thompson, 1988, argued that Romer's subsistence economy with the labor market is equivalent to another economy in which the only non-produced input is a natural resource, say coal, and nobody works. But then we are forced by Romer's logic to say that those who must sell coal power are coal exploited. Now, this is true, but the generalized commodity exploitation theorem of Romer is precisely one of Romer's arguments to prove the irrelevance of the labor theory of value and a fortiori of Marxian exploitation. You see, this is I assume a kind of regress. A priori critiques of the abstract and static nature of Romer's models are not per se conclusive either. Romer repeatedly acknowledges the static nature of his models and the importance of disequilibrium and dynamics, most explicitly in 1982 Romer. Yet, constructing a model of capitalism that would reveal its essentially dynamic features is a different task from what mine was. The logical structure of Romer's argument is different. In the real world, we observe X, that is DOPA, Y, coercion in the labor process,
And there's no sound.
Testing. One, how's that?
All good.
All righty. Well, so you missed all my dulcet remarks, thank God. My commentary. Anyway, instead, from a methodological viewpoint, a formal dynamic model proves extremely useful in the analysis of the possibility of providing neoclassical, specifically, well, Walrasian microfoundations to Marxian economics. In particular, a model that aims to provide micro-foundations to Marxist concepts of exploitation and class must be able to account for their persistence, since, according to Marx, they are inherent features of a capitalist economy. From a substantive viewpoint, a allows dynamic model allows one to assess the causal and moral relevance of DOPA, focusing on its role in generating exploitation and classes as persistent features of a competitive economy in which agents can save and the distribution of productive assets can change over time. The advantage of this strategy is twofold. First, the robustness of Romer's core arguments can be directly evaluated at the appropriate level of abstraction. Thus, the results derived in Veneziani 2005-6 can be interpreted as follows. Let D, capital D, denote the dynamic features of the economy, that is, agents living for more than one period, savings, and intertemporal choice. Romer proves that X plus not Y plus not D becomes Z as a persistent phenomenon. Instead, Veneziani proves that X plus not Y plus D becomes Z is not persistent. Second, by avoiding an a priori rejection and focusing on specific issues arising from Romer's models, this dissertation provides ground for dialogue and for further cross-fertilization, and it suggests various interesting lines for further research. That's the point that it should have reached. And since I didn't describe all this from the front end, differential ownership of productive assets is DOPA, just for those of you who forgot. Sorry. Three, four. All right, back to where we were. Exploitation and distributive justice. If to note here, this is very important because this is the latter part of Romer's oeuvre, or you know, Zeitschrift is on distributive justice. Based on this taxonomy of exploitation, Romer suggests an original interpretation of historical materialism, according to which, quote, history progresses by the successive elimination of dynamically, socially unnecessary forms of exploitation. It's Romer 1986b, footnote 26. Thus, for instance, when feudal exploitation becomes a fetter to the development of the forces of production, class struggle leads to its elimination and to the passage from a feudal to a capitalist mode of production. Now, how controversial is that? You have to sort of deal with it. More importantly, for the purposes of this dissertation, this theory naturally leads to an original normative approach by defining an historical, materialist, ethical imperative. See, we're going towards Kant, right? Which requires the elimination of socially unnecessary exploitation in order to promote the self-actualization of men and of man as the unquestionable good. But also on distributive grounds, since the exploitation-free society provides a natural egalitarian benchmark with an unequal distribution of transferable resources to compensate for unequal endowments of skills and needs. Nevertheless, Romer's asset-based theory of exploitation is not a complete theory of distributive justice. The injustice of an exploitative allocation depends on the injustice of the initial distribution of alienable and inalienable assets. Romer 1988. While the moral arbitrariness of the distribution of feudal privilege is rather clear, the same is not true for skills, needs, and most importantly, physical assets. And this is a reference here to Nozick of 1974. In his book, Free to Lose, Romer explicitly discusses the morality of differential ownership of productive assets and a off fortiori of capitalist exploitation, and suggests that it is morally objectionable since it's typically the product either of immoral original accumulation, i.e., robbery and plunder, or of morally arbitrary factors such as socially determined differential rates of time preference and entrepreneurial abilities, or even sheer luck. Now, in the latter case, even if asset inequalities have risen in morally respectable ways, Romer briefly suggests that the resulting exploitation can still be condemned on grounds of equality of opportunity, even though no comprehensive discussion is provided. From this perspective, Romer's asset-based theory of exploitation can be seen as an equality of opportunity approach in Nuce, which suggests the fairly controversial view that the Marxist ethical imperative requires the progressive elimination of different forms of exploitation in order to equalize opportunities, footnote 28. Now, this establishes an interesting unexplored link between analytic Marxism and the modern theories of equality of opportunity, which are the object of the next section. Of course, we're at the end. It's a conclusion to be completed. So we'll look for we'll introduce the final version of this, but you can see that this problem has been there sitting around for 20 years, and you can see it was a kind of a lit review introduction to his dissertation. So you can see some of that at work and some very interesting things in the bibliography, including Gil Skillman's work and a variety of other folks with some serious critiques of certain key features that required greater explication, but since this is the front end of a dissertation, I assume, Veneziani, I will have to go hunt that down and get this to work out. But let me just say that in general, issues of methodological individualism are only a small feature of the history of a quote unquote analytic Marxism. And often, there is this, as what is not fully developed or perhaps reproblematized is the idea of an anti-positivist science. What does an anti-positivist science look like? You know, um, is it an anarchistic approach? Let's put it that way. Is it, something that against method might address, for example, among many other kind of methodological approaches, or does it need to be critiqued from certain other directions? I would assert that, this is in terms of a dissertation, as probably a first chapter or second chapter, you sort of need to see where the linkages are going to go, and that a complete critique, because as I think you can see over the last 10 or so years, that the distributive justice question is still a lively idea. It's not a dead end. And in fact, there's, an interesting literature. It's better developed. It has other extensions that I think are more interesting that require, I think, a consideration from certain other perspectives, whether it is as it were, a more positivist antitrust point of view, let's put it that way. I'm not sure you want to put it that way necessarily, but some other law and political economy approach that includes perhaps critical legal studies, a variety of other kind of perspectives on the subjectivity question, um, an expansion of the question of distributive justice more fully examined in the 21st century, and a variety of other matters. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave it today. Tomorrow, we will try and clean some of this up. As I said, I should have gotten this done yesterday, and so we could have started a new thing, but we're going to try and clean it up. Today, we looked at definition two, strong analytic Marxism or rational choice Marxism. Nobody talks like this anymore. And some of its, sort of stipulations, claims and conditions. Any commitment to a rational actor model, on the one hand, looks interesting as a way to uh, have a conversation, reconcile itself with other um, um, so-called rationality models, and raises the question, at least in my own sort of ideas, about what counts as an irrational actor model, but that's not where we necessarily have to go. But there's sort of an interesting methodological problem. And and I would assert that in terms of addressing the more complete economic problem on identification models and a variety of other things, issues of expectations, et cetera, I think this is to completely sketch that in, looking at the later works of Bowles and Gintis and a variety of other folks, that we could sort of move that into a way of talking about distributive, and in fact, it may be the second moment, or that would be my perspective on it, that redistributive justice has a subset of a kind of valorization, and I think that you can prove this in spatial modeling. So that's kind of where I'm headed with this, and it may be a total dead end, but that's kind of where I am. So I'm going to stop now at this early date. Uh, by stopping